Du Fu, a ballad, watching a pupil of Miss Gongsun I perform the sword dance. On the 19th day of the 10th month of the second year of the Dali era, at the house of Yuan Qi, administrative aide at Guizhou, I watched Miss Li the 12th of Lingjing perform the sword dance. I so appreciated her exquisite dancing, I asked her who her teacher had been. She replied, I studied with Miss Gongsun I. In the third year of the Kaijuan era, when I was still a boy, I remember seeing Miss Gongsun perform the sword dance and the felt hat dance at Jiangcheng. The freedom and spontaneity of her dancing were the finest of her day. In the early years of the former emperor, among all the women of the Welcoming Spring or Pear Garden imperial dancing schools, or other dancers occasionally invited to the palace who performed before him, Miss Gongsun was the only one able to perform these dances. Gradually, her beauty faded, just as my hair turned white. Even this woman, her student, is no longer young. Having settled the question of origins, knowing their styles were the same, and overcome with emotion about these events in the past, I wrote this Ballad of the Sword Dance. Long ago, Zhang Zhu of Wu was a master of the cursive calligraphy style. Many times he saw Miss Gongsun I perform the West River sword dance at Zhexian. After that, his cursive style became even more beautiful, with a lofty spirit and a profound sense of movement, influenced by the great art of Miss Gongsun. Long ago, there was a beautiful woman named Gongsun, whose sword dance moved the four quarters of the world. A mountain of spectators watched her in amazement. Heaven and earth rose and fell, following her motion. Light flashed from her sword as when great Ji shot the 9 suns down. Her graceful leaps were flying immortals mounted on dragons. When she began, drums sounded with the fury of thunder. When she ended, light reflected from the frozen sea of faces. Then her pink lips were silent and her pearl sleeves were stilled. Now her masterful dancing lives on only in her student. The beauty from Lingjing, here at the White Emperor's city, sings and dances with a Skandhan genius. In my question and her answer were the key to her art, and I ponder, sadly, the turn of our life and times. The late emperor had 80,000 women in his palace. At the sword dance, among them all, Miss Gongsun ranked first. 50 years have passed in the flick of a hand. The dust of war has darkened the imperial palace. The students of the Pear Garden have been scattered like mist. Only this woman remains, alone in the chill of dusk. The trees on the bright emperor's tomb are already tall, and I am here in the Chutang Gorge, where the grass has withered. After the banquet, as its stirring music stills, joy already fades as the crescent moon rises. I am an old man, not knowing where I'm going next, but moss grows beneath my feet. I must head into the mountains. So here we have yet another poem by Du Fu. I think it's the last of his heptasyllabic gushi. And as you have seen, it is introduced by a very lengthy prologue, which explains the context of creation, the background, and so on. So during the High Tang era, like most empires, the Tang Empire was a cosmopolitan civilization. Empires, when they are at their peak, tend to be receptive of foreign customs, foreign traditions, foreign culture, and Tang China was no exception. One of these imports were women from the West. For the Chinese, the West would have been Persia or Central Asia, with big eyes, colorful hair, and exotic dances. So these women dancers from the West entertained rich and poor alike, from the imperial court to the lowly taverns, and they appear in a lot of Tang poems. Both their art of dancing and of their exotic dances and their own beauty as objects of desire and aesthetic pleasure for the male Confucian scholar's gaze. So this poem, the topic of this poem, as you probably have guessed, is dancing, is a description and an appreciation of the aesthetic beauty of the marvel of the sword dance of this lady, Miss Gongsun I. She and her art are not being appreciated directly. Rather, it's been some years since this lady has stopped acting and singing. And it's a disciple of hers, the one that Du Fu sees in the city of Guizhou, and he goes back to the past while seeing the wonderful sword dance of the disciple to the wonderful sword dance of the mistress. So the main topic, art, in this case, the art of the dance, its spell, its beauty, its seductiveness. Secondary topics, nostalgia for the past, which is very important because what Du Fu is really missing is the dance of the original dancer of Miss Gongsun, and metonymically the time in which Miss Gongsun died, the time before the An Lushan rebellion, the Kaijuan era of golden splendor for the Tang dynasty. So appreciation of art, immortalization of art through a poem of another art form, in this case dance, nostalgia for a prosperous past as opposed to a miserable and sad present. In this respect, this poem is very similar to previous poems that we've read of Du Fu, which were related to painting, more specifically the two poems about the paintings of General Cao Ba, which also contained the same element of appreciation and ekphrastic description of a work of art, and nostalgia for the golden past when the artist and his art were more appreciated by a more prosperous and successful Chinese nation. So let's go couplet by couplet. This poem is divided in the form that is presented in this book into two stanzas, which do generally correspond with two big sections, you could say. In the first one, we get the description of Miss Gongsun's dance, sword dance in the past, and the marvelous effect it had. And at the end of that section, of that stanza, we get a jump into the present when Du Fu sees the disciple of Lady Gongsun, in this case another lady who studied with her, Miss Li the 12th. And in the second stanza, we again go back in time. We remember the glorious times, but only very briefly, only to mention how times have changed, putting the emphasis on the decay, on the death, on the disappearance, on the melancholy of the present. So let's go. Long ago, there was a beautiful woman named Gongsun, whose sword dance moved the four corners of the world. So the poem starts introducing the dancer of yore, who danced the sword dance, and we've already mentioned that the High Tang era was famous for exotic dances and exotic beauties, and this is one of them. And we both appreciate the beauty of the woman and the beauty of the dance. And it was universally admired in the four quarters of the Tang world, of the empire, although we might imagine especially in the capital. A mountain of spectators watched her in amazement. Heaven and earth rose and fell following her motion. So the poet is hyperbolically describing the spellbound effect of this dance, which is so seductive that a huge crowd gathers round. He's a bit probably hyperbolic, but Chang'an was a city of 1 million inhabitants in the middle of the 8th century. So probably there was indeed big crowds. There were big crowds to watch the sword dance. And very Chinese, nature, not only humans, but nature also react to this wonderful work of art. So nature is an active participant and is moved by human activity. So heaven and earth themselves seem to rise and fall in rhythm with the sword dance of Lady Gongsun. Light flashed from her sword as when great Ji shot the 9 suns down. Her graceful leaps were flying immortals mounted on dragons. Very heavy use of parallelism by Du Fu in this poem, as we've seen in the previous couplets and as we'll see in the next ones. So here two images continue, two erudite academic images complement the previous description of the dance. The light from her sword is like the light when the great Ji, as a mythological figure from the Chinese past, shot 9 out of the 10 suns because they were burning the earth. And also her leaps, the twirls and turns that she makes, are made equivalent to those of immortals riding dragons. When she began, drums sounded with the fury of thunder. When she ended, light reflected from the frozen sea of faces. So an oral sound, a visual image. The sound of the drums, the sea of faces, and also the change from the sound to the silence as the people stand in awe at the beauty of the dance. Then her pink lips were silent and her pearl sleeves were stilled. Now her masterful dancing lives on only in her student. So this couplet leads the transition inside of the first stanza to the second part. This was in the past. Then she ended the dance and she was quiet, still and beautiful, gorgeously bedecked. Now it's not her, but a disciple, a student of hers, who, as if it were, continues the dance in the present. The dance only lives now in the student, and we jump to Du Fu's present when or immediately after he is seeing this sword dance again being danced. The beauty from Lingjing, here at the White Emperor's city, sings and dances with resplendent genius. So the White Emperor's city, that was in Sichuan, so we might imagine this poem was composed when Du Fu was in Sichuan. In my question and her answer were the key to her art, and I ponder sadly the turn of our life and times. So this was already explained in the introduction. After the dance, after seeing the dance at the house of a friend, Du Fu talks with Miss Li the 12th, asks her where she learned to dance this dance so well, and then he goes into a long explanation of how her teacher, Miss Gongsun I, had been the greatest dancer of the world in the time of the Kaijuan era. Melancholy notes, that's the most important because it's the poignant, the sad tone that permeates this poem. Not only the beautiful appreciation of a great dance, nostalgia for the original dancer, and nostalgia for the era in which the original dancer danced. There's a contrast between the glorious past and the miserable present. And I ponder sadly the turn of our life and times. We have gone from the zenith to the nadir. We have gone from the splendor of the Hai Tang era, in which the empire was stable, rich, prosperous, culturally flourishing, militarily expansionist, to now an era of brutal war, of infighting, of the An Lushan rebellion not yet healed, of the country in turmoil, on the dynasty at the verge of collapse. And on Du Fu, cut off from his life as a civil servant in the capital and wandering around the country like a beggar. Next stanza, and this poignant contrast between the past and the present is accentuated in the couplets of the second stanza. The late emperor had 80,000 women in his palace. At the sword dance, among them all, Miss Gongsun ranked first. So out of all of those dancers, Miss Gongsun was the best. And there were 80,000. He's probably exaggerating a bit, but there were many women at the imperial court. In fact, in the introduction, two dancing schools, the Pear Garden and the Welcoming Spring imperial dancing schools, are mentioned. The previous emperor, Emperor Xuanzong, had been a great patron of the arts, and himself a relatively good musician, I think a flute player. 50 years have passed in the flick of a hand. The dust of war has darkened the imperial palace. So when first he saw the dance, as in the prologue he mentioned, Du Fu was still a child. It was at the beginning of the Kaijuan era, probably. And Emperor Xuanzong had a very, very long reign. He lived until quite old age. And now this is after the An Lushan rebellion. So 50 years have passed. time passes, the passage of time, always a constant reminder and a sad current in all Chinese poetry. Time has passed, war has passed, and it has darkened the imperial palace, not only figuratively, but literally. The rebels took the capital and semi-burnt, or not semi, completely burned some of the imperial palaces. The students of the Pear Garden have been scattered like mist. Only this woman remains, alone in the chill of dusk. The chill of dusk is the chill of dusk, perhaps of the day in which Du Fu saw Miss Li XII in Quizhou, but it's also the dusk of an era, the end of the Hai Tang period, of the time of splendor. We live now in a sunset, in a dusk era, where the great artists of the past have disappeared and will keep on disappearing. The trees on the bright emperor's tomb are already tall, and I am here in the Chutang Gorge, where the grass has withered. So the bright emperor is another name, Ming Huang, another name used for referring to Tang Xuanzong, the previous emperor. So long has he been dead already that the trees over his tomb mound have grown quite tall. After the banquet, as its stirring music stills, joy already fades as the crescent moon rises. So the moon is coming out, the banquet has finished, the temporary reprieve from sadness that the pleasure of listening and watching this dance has given the poet finish with a song, and the sad nostalgia for what has been lost all the more intensifies as this song arouses, as we've just said, memories of its being played in a more prosperous and happy era when everybody was younger as well. Conclusion. Du Fu sets himself on the road to retirement. I am an old man, not knowing where I'm going next, but moss grows beneath my feet. I must head into the mountains. So, as with many Chinese poems, the poem concludes with an instruction or a promise of retiring from the world. Because the poetic persona of Du Fu is old and withered and the times are dark and out of joint, the only sensible option is to retire. Du Fu wrote many poems making contrast between the splendor of the Hai Tang era and the fall, as if it were, after the Anlushan rebellion. In fact, we've encountered some of his poems which had the same tenor as this one, this contrasting between past happiness, splendor, and present misery, and also this very careful intertwining of this past splendor, which was the splendor of the nation and the splendor of subjective, personal youth and well-being and hopes of advancement for Du Fu himself. This is something that Du Fu does very well in his poems. He's able to merge the personal, the subjective, with the collective predicament of the nation in its time of decline. So, quite a masterful work of art, a nice reflection on art, and an appraisal of an art form that has been all but lost for us forever, just like most of the paintings of General Zhao, which were mentioned a few poems ago. But poetry lasts longer, even though it's not sculpted into metal or bronze, even though it is painted with ink on paper or silk. Today we can still read the words of Du Fu and still picture in the theatre of our mind the dance, the sword dance of Miss Gongsun.